The initial encounters of Axis soldiers with American battlefield medical care often left them in a state of profound shock, a memory that would persist for decades. For those trained to expect inevitable suffering in war if they were injured, witnessing medics advance under fire, seemingly fearless of incoming bullets, was nearly unfathomable. These medics donned white armbands emblazoned with a red cross, a striking symbol against the backdrop of mud and blood on the front lines. For German, Italian, and Japanese soldiers, this emblem represented more than a mere insignia. It was evidence that the Americans were willing to treat battlefield medicine as an integral part of their combat strategy. While other armies frequently abandoned the severely wounded to their fate until the fighting ceased, American medics ventured into peril within minutes. Survivors from the Axis would later recount their astonishment. A German infantryman captured in North Africa recounted how, following a firefight, he witnessed American medics arrive almost immediately at the scene of fallen soldiers. This remarkable speed was no coincidence. The U.S. Army had invested years in creating a system where medics operated in pairs or small teams, trained to quickly identify the injured and stabilize them with bandages, morphine, or even plasma before transporting them back behind the lines. For Axis observers, the impression was jarring. This was not the disorganized rush they were accustomed to, but rather a systematic extension of warfare itself. The Americans held the belief that preserving a wounded soldier was as vital as achieving victory in combat. This philosophy was evident not only in the bravery of the medics, but also in their extensive training. Unlike stretcher bearers in many Axis units, who were often regarded as secondary and inadequately equipped, U.S. medics underwent rigorous training. They were taught not only how to carry or drag injured men, but also how to control bleeding, create makeshift splints, and administer morphine under duress. Axis prisoners would later admit they had never witnessed such meticulous care for battlefield injuries, especially so close to the front lines. Additionally, there were instances of cultural misunderstandings. Axis soldiers were instructed that revealing oneself in combat zones was an act of recklessness bordering on insanity. Nevertheless, the Americans provided their medics with visible insignia, anticipating that enemy soldiers would adhere to the conventions of warfare and spare them. Although these conventions were not always respected, this audacious choice enabled medics to operate with a speed that astonished their adversaries. A German officer in Sicily allegedly commented that it appeared as though the Americans possessed a second army, one comprised of doctors trailing closely behind the rifles. The astonishment was further intensified by the profound humanity displayed. In certain instances, American medics even attended to wounded enemy soldiers when the tumult of the battlefield permitted. Tales circulated among captured Axis personnel about individuals who, after sustaining gunshot wounds or burns, regained consciousness to find themselves bandaged or treated by the very enemy they had attempted to kill mere hours prior. For soldiers accustomed to the more severe codes of warfare, this was nearly inconceivable. These initial encounters with American medical assistants left Axis troops both shaken and contemplative. They came to understand that the Americans did not solely engage in battles with firearms and armored vehicles. They fought to preserve every life, including those severely injured. For soldiers raised on the ruthless efficiency of Axis principles, where the wounded often remained unattended until the battle's outcome was determined, this was a revelation. It appeared that America had redefined battlefield medicine as a tool of morale, a system crafted not only to save lives, but also to assure every soldier that he would not be forsaken. This was merely the onset of what would evolve into one of the most demoralizing shocks for Axis troops throughout the conflict. The initial impressions, the medics maneuvering through gunfire, the bandages applied amidst the whistling of shells, the morphine curettes secured in belts, were sufficient to sow the seeds of both awe and discomfort. The Axis soldiers had prepared to confront rifles and artillery. However, they encountered something far more persistent, an enemy force that was determined to ensure its soldiers did not perish without resistance. The surprise among Axis troops intensified when they discovered America's implementation of blood plasma and transfusions in combat situations. For numerous soldiers, this revelation was not merely surprising. It felt akin to witnessing a miracle. Within the German and Italian military ranks, blood transfusions were infrequent, typically reserved for prestigious medical facilities situated well behind the front lines. In the Japanese military, such practices were virtually non-existent. Conversely, for the Americans, plasma was deemed as crucial as ammunition. From the onset of the conflict, the United States made significant investments in the collection and preservation of blood products. Back home, civilians willingly donated vast quantities of blood, which would be processed into plasma and dispatched overseas. By the year 1943, American troops stationed at the front could receive life-saving transfusions within mere hours of sustaining injuries. Axis soldiers, who were accustomed to witnessing comrades succumb to wounds that appeared trivial, found it hard to fathom that a simple bag of fluid could swiftly alter the course of life and death. Captured German medics were among the first to observe this phenomenon. They were astonished to find U.S. field hospitals equipped with glass containers of plasma, meticulously labeled and stored under cool conditions. To them, it seemed like an unattainable luxury. One German physician noted post-war that the Americans seemed to carry their blood with them, as if each soldier possessed not only his firearm, but also a reservoir of life preserved for emergencies. The profound significance of plasma became evident on the battlefield. American medics transported compact kits containing plasma bottles and tubing, enabling them to initiate transfusions just moments after stabilizing an injured soldier. This was an unprecedented sight for Axis witnesses. A German officer recounted the astonishment of observing a soldier, pale and barely alive after significant blood loss, begin to regain vitality within minutes of the fluid entering his bloodstream. Where they anticipated witnessing death, they instead observed a restoration of strength. Plasma represented something much larger, a logistical system that extended from American towns and cities to the battlefronts in Europe and the Pacific. Axis soldiers, who frequently faced shortages of food, medicine, and even footwear, could not fathom how the United States managed to transport such vital supplies across vast oceans and continents. This realization was as disheartening as the plasma itself, as it highlighted not only America's compassion, but also its industrial prowess. Even more remarkable to Axis troops was the magnitude of this undertaking. By the conclusion of the war, the American Red Cross had dispatched millions of pints of plasma overseas. For U.S. soldiers, the awareness that such lifelines were available to them instilled hope and bravery. Conversely, for their adversaries, it imparted a grim understanding. America was not merely preserving lives, but also enabling soldiers to return to combat. Injuries that could have been fatal for a German or Japanese soldier were often treated sufficiently for Americans to rejoin their units within weeks. Some captured prisoners even received plasma when taken captive. Accounts exist of German and Italian soldiers being transfused by American medics following intense firefights. The incredulity in their accounts is unmistakable. They could not understand why the enemy would expend such valuable resources on them. However, the Americans frequently viewed it not as a waste, but as a duty, an obligation dictated by the rules of war and a reflection of their values. For Axis soldiers, the message was unmistakable. America had transformed medicine into a weapon of war, as effective as artillery. Where their own comrades might bleed and perish, the Americans rose again, revitalized by the lifeblood of an entire nation's sacrifices. This was not merely healing, it was a proclamation that the United States would not allow its men to be lost without a struggle. If the speed of medics and the miracle of plasma transfusions astonished Axis soldiers, the revelation of America's mobile surgical hospitals further deepened their disbelief. For numerous Germans, Italians, and Japanese soldiers, surgery was an event that took place far from the battlefield, in well-established hospitals located deep in the rear, provided that a wounded individual was fortunate enough to survive the journey. In contrast, the Americans had introduced the operating room almost directly at the front lines. The concept of mobile surgical hospitals was groundbreaking in both its scale and organization. Later recognized globally through the popular memory of MASH units, these facilities were essentially compact, highly adaptable hospitals that could be transported in trucks, tents, or prefabricated huts. They accompanied the troops as the front advanced, occasionally establishing themselves within mere miles of combat. Axis prisoners could hardly believe their eyes when they witnessed surgeons performing operations on stretchers inside large tents while artillery boomed in the distance. To the Germans, this was unimaginable. Their field hospitals were typically set up far to the rear, and transferring a patient from the front line to surgery could take hours, if not days. Infection and blood loss frequently claimed lives before medical assistance could arrive. The Japanese, fighting on isolated islands, faced even more severe conditions. Many wounded soldiers perished without treatment, not due to a lack of bravery from their comrades, but because there was simply no system capable of responding swiftly enough. In this context, America's mobile hospitals emerged as nothing short of a technological and humanitarian wonder. Within these surgical units, Axis observers remarked on the extraordinary level of care provided. Surgeons clad in khaki performed amputations, stitched torn flesh, and repaired shattered bones under electric lights powered by portable generators. Anesthesia was readily accessible, alleviating the suffering that Axis soldiers often had to endure without relief. Sterilized instruments shone in trays, nurses and orderlies operated with practiced efficiency, and the wounded were monitored with remarkable accuracy. For men conditioned to view battlefield care as merely rudimentary bandaging, it felt as if they had entered an entirely different realm. A German soldier captured in Italy in 1944 recounted his shock when he was transported to a U.S. field hospital after sustaining a severe leg injury. He anticipated either indifference or rough treatment, but to his surprise, he was assessed, sedated, and operated on within an hour. He survived, although he would never engage in combat again. His subsequent testimony expressed disbelief that the Americans would allocate such resources to save even their adversaries, while his own army frequently neglected soldiers with similar injuries. The psychological effects of these mobile hospitals extended beyond the injured individuals. Intelligence reports began to indicate that American survival rates for casualties were remarkably high. Officers recognized that this translated to more soldiers returning to active duty and fewer being permanently lost. For Axis strategists, this was a sobering realization. The Americans were not only employing superior firepower, but also demonstrating exceptional medical resilience. Each soldier saved represented a unit that remained robust, morale that remained intact, and a fighting force that was more difficult to deplete. Perhaps the most astonishing aspect was the rapidity with which these hospitals could dismantle and relocate. Axis forces occasionally encountered deserted American surgical units, astonished at how swiftly a sophisticated medical facility could disappear overnight, leaving only traces in the soil. This showcased a level of mobility and adaptability that few had deemed feasible. For the Axis soldiers who witnessed them firsthand, these mobile hospitals challenged all their preconceived notions about modern warfare. They came to understand that the Americans were not only ready to engage in battles, but also to combat death itself at the forefront of the battlefield. For those who had observed countless comrades succumb due to a lack of care, this realization was profoundly devastating. The soldiers of America were not merely men. They were supported by a system that provided them with a second opportunity, almost as if the battlefield itself had been altered to enhance their chances of survival. If the existence of mobile surgical hospitals surprised Axis soldiers, the method of transporting the injured to these facilities left an equally profound impact. The Americans had established a comprehensive evacuation network, a seamless chain designed to swiftly transport injured personnel from the battlefield to safety in record time. Axis troops, who were used to seeing wounded comrades abandoned for hours or even days, were taken aback by the efficiency with which the U.S. Army converted jeeps, trucks, and even airplanes into vital lifelines. On the ground, the process began with small teams of medics carrying stretchers. Once a soldier was stabilized, he was transferred to collection points where modified jeeps awaited. These vehicles, equipped with racks for stretchers, could traverse rough terrain while transporting multiple casualties simultaneously. Axis observers, who primarily recognized jeeps as light reconnaissance vehicles, were astonished to see them repurposed into miniature ambulances. In contrast, German and Italian forces often depended on horse-drawn carts or makeshift wagons when motorized transport was limited. The Japanese, fighting across jungles and islands, frequently had to drag their wounded through mud on bamboo litters, with evacuation times measured not in minutes, but in days. The Americans also utilized larger trucks converted into fully equipped ambulances. These vehicles transported patients further back to field hospitals, often while continuing to provide care en route. Axis prisoners who traveled in such trucks were amazed by the relative comfort and speed. For men who were used to enduring rough jolts over uneven ground or being left to suffer in the dust until a lull in fighting, the difference was stark. However, the most significant surprise came from the air. The United States pioneered large-scale aerial evacuation of wounded soldiers. From battlefields in North Africa to the jungles of New Guinea, American aircraft transported casualties to hospitals located hundreds of miles away. Nurses and medics were present on the flights, providing care to patients in mid-air. Prisoners who underwent these evacuations often found it hard to comprehend the situation. They were lying on stretchers within an aircraft, receiving treatment not as prisoners but as individuals deserving of care. The logistics involved in these airlifts astonished even the most seasoned Axis officers. It demonstrated not only a commitment to preserving lives, but also an exceptional level of coordination. From radio communications on the battlefield to pre-prepared airstrips, the entire operation functioned like a finely tuned machine. Axis forces, grappling with shortages and inadequate infrastructure, could scarcely envision maintaining such a system amidst a global conflict. These evacuation techniques significantly influenced morale. American soldiers were aware that if they sustained injuries, assistance was merely minutes away. This assurance fortified their resolve, enabling them to fight with increased determination. In contrast, Axis soldiers often battled with the grim realization that a serious injury could lead to abandonment or death. Captured diaries from German troops reflect bitter comparisons. Our wounded remain where they fall, while the Americans transport theirs away, as if death holds no power over them. The integration of ground and air evacuation fostered a cycle of resilience. Soldiers swiftly extracted from the battlefield, treated in mobile hospitals and flown to rear facilities, had a genuine opportunity to return to duty within weeks. To Axis observers, this was astonishing. They understood that they were not merely contending with men armed with rifles. They were facing an army bolstered by an unseen force, one that intervened in the turmoil of combat and rescued its soldiers from peril. The image of jeeps traversing shell-damaged fields adorned with red crosses or planes, taking off with stretchers neatly arranged inside, was indelible. For Axis soldiers, it felt as though America had triumphed on the battlefield twice, first through firepower and then through compassion. Among all the shocks experienced by Axis soldiers when they encountered American medical care, none resonated more profoundly than the revelation of battlefield pain relief and antibiotics. For men raised in armies where suffering was often regarded as unavoidable, the notion that a soldier could be wounded and instantly spared from hours of agony seemed almost inconceivable. However, for American troops, morphine and subsequently penicillin became integral to their daily survival. The sight of morphine cigarettes, which were small disposable tubes equipped with attached needles, represented one of the most striking revelations. Medics carried these in bandoliers across their chests, enabling them to administer injections within seconds. A wounded individual convulsing in shock could be soothed and stabilized in mere moments. Axis soldiers, who were accustomed to comrades screaming during amputations or enduring untreated wounds until death, were astonished to witness pain alleviated so rapidly. One German prisoner later commented that it was as if the Americans brought pockets of mercy into the battlefield. Although the use of morphine was not entirely foreign to Axis armies, it was limited, strictly regulated, and seldom accessible at the front lines. For Japanese troops engaged in remote jungle warfare, such relief was virtually non-existent. Pain was endured with clenched teeth, often leading to fatal outcomes from shock and blood loss. In stark contrast, The Americans regarded pain management as an essential component of preserving lives, rather than a mere luxury. Their methodology altered the pace of warfare. Wounded soldiers remained composed. Medics operated more efficiently, and morale surged as soldiers understood they would not be abandoned to suffer. Even more remarkable was the introduction of antibiotics. Penicillin, which was first mass-produced by the United States during the conflict, transformed battlefield medicine. Axis soldiers observed in disbelief as infections that would have claimed lives in their own ranks were effectively halted with just a few injections. In North Africa and Italy, captured German physicians examined American practices and recognized they were witnessing the emergence of a new era in medicine. Until that time, gangrene and sepsis were prevalent causes of death. Currently, U.S. troops are able to survive injuries that would have seemed hopeless by Axis standards. Additionally, there were tales that circulated among Axis prisoners, tales that were almost too miraculous to accept. Individuals with severe burns or infected wounds, who under their own medical systems would have been abandoned to die, were able to walk again due to American doctors' access to penicillin. For Axis soldiers, raised in cultures where the battlefield often consumed men entirely, this was akin to witnessing death itself retreat. The psychological impact was significant. American soldiers entered combat with a confidence that their adversaries could not replicate. They were aware that not only would medics arrive promptly, but that pain relief and infection management awaited them. This certainty provided them with resilience in the face of fire, a bravery that appeared reckless to Axis observers, yet was fundamentally rooted in their trust in the medical system. Conversely, Axis troops fought under a pall. The awareness that even a wound that could be survived might lead to a slow, painful demise. Captured diaries recount German soldiers comparing the treatment their comrades received to what they witnessed among Americans. "They fight without fear," one wrote with bitterness, "because even when shot, they continue to live." Japanese accounts express disbelief that Americans would dedicate so much effort to preserving individual soldiers' lives, rather than concentrating solely on victory. However, this was America's strength, an industrial nation capable of conducting war with both weaponry and medicine. Ultimately, morphine and penicillin emerged as symbols of America's superiority, not only in factories or arsenals, but also in compassion harnessed through scientific advancement. Axis soldiers were unable to grasp the magnitude at which these drugs were manufactured and distributed. What they repeatedly observed was the outcome: men rescued from the brink of death, their suffering alleviated, their lives preserved. It was a revolution unfolding right before their eyes, filling them with both wonder and despair. If the relief of pain and the use of antibiotics appeared to be magical to the soldiers of the Axis, the discipline and professionalism exhibited by American medics left an equally profound impression on them. Many armies of the Axis had stretcher-bearers or medical orderlies. However, these individuals were frequently inadequately trained, selected at random, or assigned from among those deemed unfit for combat. In stark contrast, the United States regarded its medics as specialists who underwent training with nearly the same intensity as infantry soldiers, and were acknowledged as essential components in the chain of survival. Axis prisoners consistently remarked on the meticulous manner in which American medics operated. They did not enter chaotic situations unprepared. They collaborated in pairs, and at times in teams with clearly delineated responsibilities. One soldier would administer first aid, another would monitor for shock, while others would ready themselves to transport the injured. This was not the spontaneous improvisation that was prevalent among Axis forces, but rather a systematic procedure that was practiced until it became second nature. German officers, accustomed to witnessing stretcher-bearers panic or become immobilized under fire, were astonished by how U.S. medics advanced, often disregarding incoming fire, fully concentrated on their responsibilities. The foundation of this distinction was training. American medics underwent specialized courses prior to being deployed to the front lines. They acquired knowledge in anatomy, triage, the application of tourniquets, and even how to create splints from rifles or branches. They were trained to discern when morphine was necessary, when plasma could save a life, and when a wound was beyond hope. Accounts from Axis soldiers depicted them almost as a different type of soldier, armed not with firearms but with expertise. In reality, the U.S. Army had acknowledged that each medic was invaluable, as he could be the determining factor between life and death for numerous comrades. Their discipline transcended mere training. Witnesses from the Axis were taken aback by the manner in which American medics adhered to a stringent code of conduct. They donned their Red Cross armbands with honor, refrained from carrying weapons unless absolutely essential, and dedicated themselves to treating all injured individuals, including adversaries, whenever feasible. Accounts emerged of German and Italian prisoners receiving care from U.S. medics who had only hours before been their adversaries. Such commitment to medical duty was alien to many Axis soldiers, who were instructed to prioritize their own ranks and frequently left enemy casualties without assistance. The professionalism exhibited by American medics also had a significant impact on combat dynamics. Soldiers were aware that they could place their complete trust in the medics. In correspondence sent home, numerous U.S. troops referred to their medics as the most courageous individuals on the battlefield. This trust bolstered morale. Soldiers fought with greater determination, knowing that a trained, disciplined, and dedicated medic would come to their aid if they were injured. Axis prisoners contrasted this with their own experiences, where stretcher bearers were often overwhelmed, disorganized, or too frightened to approach until the gunfire ceased. Captured German physicians later expressed a reluctant admiration. They analyzed American casualty statistics and were astonished by the survival rates. They recognized that behind these figures lay not only advancements in technology such as plasma or penicillin, but also the relentless efforts of medics who maintained discipline under fire. Japanese soldiers, who typically valued stoic endurance over medical assistance, were similarly impressed by the dedication of these individuals. For them, the notion that a soldier's life warranted such extraordinary effort, even in the face of severe injuries, was nearly unfathomable. This discipline revealed a broader truth about America itself. Axis troops began to understand that the U.S. Army was not simply a group of fighters, but a comprehensive system of interconnected roles, each refined through training and reinforced by a sense of duty. The medics epitomized this system, remaining calm, organized, prepared, and unwavering in their mission. In the perception of Axis observers, they transformed what could have descended into chaos into a meticulously coordinated battle against death itself. For Axis soldiers, this stark contrast was disheartening. They came to understand that America had established an army in which even the most vulnerable member, the injured soldier, was not abandoned, but was instead supported through discipline, training, and steadfast medical attention. As the conflict continued, and the battles became increasingly brutal, Axis troops began to observe another aspect of American medical care that appeared almost unbelievable: the survival rates. Injuries that would have been fatal in their own forces were frequently overcome by U.S. personnel. This phenomenon was not merely theoretical. It manifested in the statistics of soldiers returning to active duty, the morale of American units, and the quiet astonishment of their adversaries. German commanders first recognized this during the North African campaign. They had witnessed numerous comrades perish from abdominal wounds, chest traumas, or significant blood loss long before a surgeon could provide assistance. However, they observed Americans rescuing soldiers with comparable injuries from the edge of death. By 1943, information circulated among German troops indicating that a U.S. soldier's likelihood of survival after sustaining injuries was significantly greater than that of a German soldier. For some, this seemed like mere propaganda until they witnessed it themselves. One captured German soldier in Italy recounted how, following a firefight, he anticipated the moans of the injured to gradually fade into silence, as was often the case in his own army. Instead, he was astonished to see U.S. medics swarm the battlefield, evacuating men within minutes. Days later, those same individuals returned to combat. "They come back from the dead," he bitterly remarked, likening them to an army capable of replenishing itself even in the absence of reinforcements. The statistics were striking. By the conclusion of the war, the U.S. Army had achieved survival rates nearing 70% for combat injuries, a figure that was unparalleled by most Axis forces. Japanese soldiers engaged on isolated islands with minimal medical resources often witnessed fewer than half of their wounded survive. Even the Germans, with their disciplined military and skilled surgeons, faced challenges due to severe shortages of medicine, plasma, and antibiotics. To access the eyes, the American advantage appeared almost supernatural, as though their adversaries had discovered a means to defy death itself. The effect on morale was tremendous. American soldiers approached combat with the understanding that if they were injured, they had a significant likelihood of survival. This confidence endowed them with a resilience that perplexed Axis forces. German diaries document bitter comments indicating that the Americans fought without fear of injury because they had faith in their medical system to rescue them. In contrast, Axis soldiers frequently bore the grim realization that any serious wound could not only terminate their service, but also their lives. Even more astonishing were instances of soldiers returning to the front lines after recuperating from injuries that Axis troops deemed fatal. An American infantryman shot in the chest might re-emerge weeks later, bandaged and prepared for duty. Axis soldiers spoke of these individuals in hushed tones, as if they were specters. This served as evidence that America's healthcare system rendered its army inexhaustible. Captured Axis physicians validated this disparity. They scrutinized U.S. casualty statistics and were astonished by the extent of recovery. Penicillin alone was responsible for saving thousands of lives, preventing infections that had claimed lives for centuries. When combined with swift evacuation, skilled surgeons, and disciplined medics, the outcome was a survival rate that overshadowed anything the Axis could accomplish. For Axis soldiers, this reality was both awe-inspiring and demoralizing. They were not merely confronting a better-armed foe, they were up against an enemy that appeared impervious to the natural losses of war. Each battle that should have inflicted heavy casualties on the Americans instead returned thousands of men to the fray. For Axis troops, the conclusion was unavoidable. They were contending with an army not only supported by factories and ships, but also bolstered by medicine itself. By the war's final years, the psychological burden of America's battlefield medical system weighed heavily on Axis soldiers. The unsettling nature of the situation was not solely due to the presence of plasma bottles, morphine cigarettes, or mobile surgical tents. Rather, it stemmed from the understanding that these elements fundamentally altered the mindset of the U.S. Army. In contrast to Axis troops, who were trained to believe that the fear of death equally bound every soldier, this realization proved to be devastating. They recognized that American soldiers fought with a level of confidence that was seldom paralleled. The knowledge that medics would arrive within minutes, that morphine would alleviate their pain, that antibiotics would prevent infections, and that evacuation planes could transport them to safety all contributed to diminishing the paralyzing fear associated with combat injuries. German officers noted with concern that U.S. troops appeared unafraid of sustaining injuries because their system offered a second chance. This was profoundly disconcerting for Axis forces. Traditionally, war had depended on the threat of suffering to undermine morale. However, America had effectively neutralized that weapon through medical advancements. The repercussions extended well beyond the battlefield. Prisoners who had been treated in American hospitals often found it difficult to reconcile their experiences with what they had witnessed. Some had received plasma, others had their wounds sutured under anesthesia, and still others had infections treated with penicillin. For individuals who anticipated neglect or cruelty, the compassion demonstrated through such treatment was astonishing. Many later confessed that this shattered their perception of the enemy more effectively than any propaganda could. Reports circulated among Axis ranks, conveyed through rumors, letters, and hushed conversations. Soldiers began to whisper that the Americans were not only superior in terms of tanks and aircraft, but also in their capacity for mercy. This realization had a corrosive impact. If the Americans could sustain their troops at such high survival rates, then the war of attrition that Axis leaders depended upon was already doomed. Each American casualty was not a definitive loss, but often merely a temporary setback. The Japanese in particular found this concept utterly incomprehensible. In their culture, where the stoic endurance of pain and death was deemed honorable, the notion of allocating such extensive resources to save the wounded appeared almost foreign. Nevertheless, even they could not refute the outcomes. On the battlefields of the islands, they observed Americans retrieving their casualties by boat or plane within hours, while Japanese wounded were left to die. This disparity undermined morale, instilling a quiet despair that no slogans of sacrifice could entirely conceal. By 1945, the Axis powers could clearly see what had previously been merely a suspicion. America's battlefield medical care had evolved into a strategic asset. It was not just about saving lives. It was about sustaining the spirit of an army. A U.S. soldier did not enter battle alone. He bore with him the assurance of a medic's assistance, a surgeon's expertise, and the medical advancements of a nation. In contrast, Axis soldiers marched under the burden of dread, aware that if they fell, assistance might never arrive. This distinction resonated through every engagement. Axis troops described their experience as fighting against an enemy with seemingly infinite lives. In reality, what they confronted was a system that prioritized human survival as much as victory. To the Axis, this was nearly inconceivable. To the Americans, it represented the natural manifestation of their industrial might, medical ingenuity, and resolve to preserve soldiers' lives. Ultimately, America's battlefield medicine accomplished more than merely treating injuries. It transformed the psychology of warfare. It instilled courage in U.S. troops, diminished death's hold, and conveyed a message to the enemy that this army could not be exhausted in traditional ways. Axis soldiers found it hard to believe what they witnessed, yet they could not dispute it either. The Americans had weaponized compassion, and it had played a crucial role in tipping the balance of the war.